All right, we're going to get started tonight. Come on in. Glad to see all of you, and it just feels like there's things growing among us as we bump into each other on Wednesday night. A little smaller format, but catching up with people. I love it. I think that's a necessity in our faith. I think it's a necessity for the well-being of our soul and for the connection we have with one another. So really, really glad that you are here tonight. And looking forward to the time that we have together to study. I hope that, has anybody had like any actual practical improvement in your stress level as we've gone through this study? Does anybody feel like you've gotten a few?
Somebody might be stressed out if they go out and their battery's dead. There's a GMC Envoy, lights are on, tag number.
GMC Envoy.
595 WD5.
Yes, someone's lights are on. GMC Envoy. So just whoever needs to use the restroom and or go turn your lights off. Yeah, so that you make sure. We have jumper cables, so if you need them, we'll jump you. All right. Let's roll in. We have actually a lot to cover tonight. In lesson 5, we're going to do 2 separate lies. I don't want to take a lot of time introducing it or getting into it. I do want to mention we have like 60 ladies signed up for Galentine's. So if you have not yet, you want to be a part of that. So if you're around, sign up. Make sure that you're here for that. Sunday, we are kicking off grow groups for our 6th graders, which is essentially that during the service, I believe it's the first service they're going to do it at. It's in your Hope Notes, which all of you, of course, get. And if you don't get it, you should be getting Hope Notes so that you know what's going on at church. 6th graders are going to leave after worship and go to their own study back in Go Zone 2, down the hall here on the side. And for 6 weeks, they're going to have their own it's a helpful transition from being in Go Zone to being in the big auditorium, as well as an introduction to youth group and stuff like that. So that is coming starting this Sunday, so you want to be a part of that. And also we're going to kick off Choices of the Heart Baby Bottles campaign on Sunday. They're already back there, and we're going to distribute those Sunday, and you're welcome to take one tonight. They are going to be due back March 6th, I believe. So a full month after we kick it off. So be a part of any of that. All right, so we have 2 lies tonight. We've already covered 3 separate lies that get us. I want to remind you that this is not comprehensive, right? We talk about this, even tonight as we talk about these 2 lies. I'm not going to go through everything. I can't possibly. I'm not the Spirit of God, and your life has an infinite number of variations from what's true. But we're going to talk about these principles that maybe then the Spirit would take and apply to your life. The reality for all of us is, if all you do is sit and listen and nod, like in your soul, assent, like, yeah, that's true, and then you walk out and kind of let it slide off of you, nothing's going to change. The idea of this is that you take this and you hold on to it and you kind of let the Spirit wrestle through it in your soul, searching you for, is this something that I'm getting tripped up by? You would recognize it probably pretty quickly. I'm sure there are times where we are a little blind to what we allow in our soul, but most of the time the Spirit's like, this one's you. It's troublesome when it's like, well, this is my spouse, or this is my friend, or this is my parent. Then you feel like everything you hear is about them, right? But there's the ones that are yours. They're the ones that you want to hold on to, and you want to let the Spirit wrestle through with you, as well as the ones that aren't yours. I bet you there's someone in your life that could use this information, and maybe as you learn it, God would give you a chance to share it, which would be a great way to testify to the power of God. All right, so let's get into the 2 lies for tonight. The first one is the 4th lie of our 10. And I wrote here, we compare fantasy to reality. One of the reasons that we live stressed out is that we constantly compare fantasy to reality. What do I mean by that? And I'm using fantasy as a term that can have some implications to it, especially like daydreaming or positive things, and it does mean that. But what I'm basically trying to say is I can imagine something different than what is or what was. I can use my imagination and I can imagine something different. So I look at the reality of what I have, and then I imagine something different, and I compare the 2. And I can live in stress because of the fact that they are not lined up. That I'm going to try to ensure that they do, or try to make it happen now, even many people live in a lot of stress about trying to go back into the past. We have been really, acknowledge this, we have really been trained all our life to measure ourselves by comparing to other people. All of our life. Right? When you have a kid and they start measuring your child, you know what they do? They compare to all their kids. Your child is in the whatever percentile for their height, whatever percentile for their weight. It's not all negative, but the reality is we start right away comparing, and then we live our whole life. What did you get on that test? And who's better at this sport and who wins this and that? And it's part of the fabric of life, but very quickly it becomes part of the fabric of the way that we think about our life. The way that we evaluate whether our life is going well or not is we compare it to what we can imagine. Two key phrases to recognize if this is something that's grabbing a hold of you. You find yourself saying, if only, a lot. If only I had, if only, there's a little bit of fantasy in that, a little bit of imagination. And what if? What if this? What if that? It's engaging your imagination, your fantasy, and comparing it to what is currently happening or the lack of information you have about what will happen. The what if is a kind of a different way of fantasy. We fantasize about the past. There are people that romanticize the past. We're going to see one of those examples tonight. The past was awesome, the good old days, everything was wonderful and amazing. The morals of the country were better and prices were cheaper and people were nicer and we talked to each other and we didn't have our phone. The past was wonderful. Except if you actually lived in the past, you would have been like, I can't wait for the future because this is hard, right? I'm sure all of us would love to go back to the 1800s and have to, go down to the stream to get our water and not have indoor plumbing or heating I'm sure we would all love that because the past is awesome. Yeah, but that's how we do it, right? We fantasize, we make up it, we romanticize the past, or we monsterize the past. The past was awful, the past was terrible. Everything about the past, it's depending on what I want to do with it, what I can imagine, and then compare it to the reality. We have fantasies about the present. Fantasies like this. I wish I had their life. Because, see, what happens is you imagine what it would be like to be them. I know none of you have ever done this, right? What would it be like to be them? Oh, wouldn't that be awesome? Except, what would it actually be like to be them? You think they might have some problems? You think they might have some struggles? Oh yeah, but I'm sure they're easier than mine. Are you sure? Are you sure? See that we fantasize, we imagine things. What are people thinking about me? I fantasize. In the present, I imagine stuff, and then I compare it to the reality of what I know or what I don't know. Are they really thinking what you think? Would it really be like what you wish it would be? We have fantasies about the future, and some of our stress is trying to make sure that our fantasies about the future come true. One of the places that our fantasies about the future really trip us up, and I don't mean this to sound in any way insensitive, because it's not. I'm trying to be very theoretical with you about how much we project what we wish instead of what's reality. So someone dies a tragic death. They die early in life or whatever like that. And what do people say? Oh, they died so young. If only they had lived longer. They would look at all that they missed out on. Right? Have you heard that? And what are they talking about what they missed out on? Good stuff, right? Anything bad was ever going to happen in the rest of their life? No. Everything was going to be awesome if they lived. How do we know that? We don't. But that's how we process it. Because it somehow in our humanity, it just feels right to think that way. But the reality is it makes us less content with what's actually happened. Because we ascribe to ourselves this ability to look into the future and know what would have happened. We have fantasies about what we can do, about how capable we are, about how in control we are, about what's within our abilities. We tell ourselves, if I do this or if I don't do this, then that will happen and it will all fall apart. I've got to make sure it doesn't fall apart, as if you can make sure it doesn't fall apart. And people live with superstitions, spoken out loud or not, thinking that if I make sure I do this every time, sometimes spiritual things become superstitions. Meaning, if I just read my Bible every day, then nothing bad's going to happen. That's not how that works, right? Did bad things happen to Jesus? What did he do that messed up karma? Like nothing, right? Like he was perfect and bad things happened. It's not about this superstition. It's not about control, but that's how we fantasize it. So this lie basically says this: life ought to be as easy and as good as I can imagine it to be. We have an expectation somewhere inside of us that if I compare what I'm going through to what I imagine it would be like if I weren't going through this, that what I imagine is not only realistic, but probably should be mine, and I should be therefore discontent with what I have instead. Trouble is, I can always imagine something I think would be better. So I hope that you see this. When we compare fantasy to reality, we are dooming ourselves because we can always imagine something better. So we will always be discontent, right? The secret to your life is not to try to imagine how much better it could be if God would just listen to you, or people would just get their act together, or the secret to your life is not there. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we live stressed out. Let's look at two stories where people had a fantasy about their situation. The first one is the good old days, and the passage is in the gray column off to the side. And we read this, I don't know how long ago, a year, 2 years ago. It feels like time has lost all meaning, so I don't know. It was sometime in the past as we went through Exodus, right? So Exodus 16, it's this: the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." Okay, so this passage is how long after their miraculous escape from Egypt? What's it say? About 45 days. 45 days. So 45 days after you walked out of Egypt, and I believe that the reference here is to the Red Sea crossing. So you were trapped at the Red Sea. You knew you were going to die or be taken back into slavery. There was no way out. Moses holds a stick over the water, and it parts. And you walk through on dry ground after a night where God stops the army from coming after you. You can see them, but they can't get to you. They stop the army behind you. They open up a path before you. You walk through it then God lets them come in and closes the water over them so that this army is destroyed without you even lifting a sword or having to fight a battle. That was 45 days ago. Like, for us, like Christmas. So if on Christmas Day, God had delivered you from certain death or a life of slavery by opening the Red Sea, and then killing all the people that followed you. And just an added bonus, because you wanted to remember it, for some reason you thought you might forget it, so you wanted to remember it, so you built a stack of stones on the side where you came out of the water, so you would remember it. From Christmas till now, you're like, why did you bring us out here to die? If only we were back in Egypt, where basically do you hear the summary of their life? We sat around pots of meat. It was like a smorgasbord of meat. It was just like, oh yeah, we just walk from one to the next. They're leaving out a few parts here, right? From what was going on in Egypt. And we had all the food we wanted. We were too tired to cook it or eat it, but we had so fantasy, they're comparing fantasy to reality. They left out a large part of the picture. Their view of the past became very unrealistic very quickly. So if you could just zip back in time to the Israelites, when these words come out of their mouth, what would you say to them to help them see what they were missing? What kind of words or advice could you give to even just one person, even if you just stand next to one person who was complaining, you're like, listen, what would you say? What advice would you give them so that they could see clearly again instead of being stuck in this stress, in this grief over their current situation? Where's your faith? Go back. Hey, you really believe that? I mean, you got to find your own way through the Red Sea now. Maybe you got to get a boat or something, but yeah. It's hard for us sometimes to hold ourselves accountable to actual reality when it's so easy to fantasize, when it's so easy to make up the story however we want to make it up. And here, as kind of a group project, they all fantasized about it together. Our stress about the present is magnified when we idealize the past, when we say that the past was so much better than it actually was. How many times have you lived in that sense of, if I could only go back? If I could go back and do it differently, or if I could go back to a time when it was simpler, when you're stressed out about whatever's happened in life, if I could just go back to being a kid and I didn't have any, like, that is romanticizing. And I know it's normal human stuff, but you have to have the whole conversation. You're welcome to dream whatever you want to dream. But these are not without impact. These mindsets are not without impact. So the good old days aren't always the good old days. And notice what they missed now in the present. What did they miss now because they were focused on romanticizing the past? Freedom. They were a nation, redeemed, right? Totally, there's no mention of that here. It's just the only reason you brought us out of Egypt was to kill us. Clearly. What else are they going to miss? 16-hour days. What's God about to do for them? Give them, well, he's going to take them to the promised land, but what's he doing at the end of this? Give you food. You're complaining about food. I'm going to give you food. Guess what happens when he gives them food? Why do we have to have this food? So you see, there's a momentum. There's an inertia to the way that we think about stuff. So when God gives them food because they were complaining about food, then they're like, this isn't good enough food. It just slides. And part of the reason that we live constantly dissatisfied and therefore constantly stressed about life is because we romanticize the past and we miss God's provision in the present for us. Our eyes are not fixated on God's hand in the here and now. We're not walking by faith in the here and now. All we see is that way back when, whatever that was the time of my life. Believers, do we believe that the best time of our life has passed us? It hasn't. You haven't even tasted it yet. The best time of your life is coming. Because the Lord's coming back for us. And he's going to set all things right. And he's going to deliver us from this body and all the evil and the sin and the failings and the fallings and the curse. He's going to deliver us from all of it. The best of your life is coming. And it's not a fantasy, it's a reality. So when I say we fantasize about the future, we often fantasize far too small about what we hope for. Because the hope we've been given is so much greater than the hope that we imagine in our lives. We live stressed because we focus back on idealizing the past, the good old days. Another one, and there's probably a lot of these, but fantasizing about how things are in the present. We find in 1 Kings 19, Elijah kind of making up his own storyline about his life. All right? And I'm not saying not real emotions to it. I'm not saying it's not real humanity. I'm just saying let's look at how he processes what's going on. So 1 Kings 19, 1-5, it says this. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So does anybody know the story context to that? Like what just happened in chapter 18? So Elijah is up on Mount Carmel with 450 prophets of Baal. One against 450. And he builds you build an altar, I'll build an altar. You guys go first, ask your God to bring fire. And they cry through the whole day and they start cutting themselves. And Elijah's like, maybe he's away on a trip, Maybe you need to shout a little louder. Then Elijah brings gallons and gallons and gallons of water and dumps it on his altar. And he prays a prayer that's like 20 words. And fire comes down from heaven and consumes not just the sacrifice, but the altar and the ground it sat on. This is yesterday. Okay? Today, Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. So after that, all Israel says, well, God is the Lord, clearly. I mean, no matter how thick you are, any person could see that, right? So they kill all the prophets of Baal. All 450 of them they kill. And the end of that is then Elijah goes and prays for rain, and it rains after a 3.5-year drought. So big miracles in chapter 18. Chapter 19, Ahab goes home and tells Jezebel what Elijah had done. Verse 2, so Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, this is some like real, you got some real stuff going on inside of you this is your response to that, right? Jezebel says, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay under a bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. So he faces this situation that brings stress into his life. And the situation simply is a powerful person said, oh yeah? I'm going to kill you. And for some reason, that hits Elijah, and he reacts by, what's he do? He runs. What else does he do? Praise.
Gives up on his life.
Right. He says, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Which brings up the question, if he wanted to die, he probably should have stayed, right? Like there's no connectedness. I'm running for my life. God, would you take my life? He's stressed because in his mind, he is alone. Look at verse 14. He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. Okay, so everything about that is true except one part. I am the only one left. Israel had rejected God. Israel had turned, clearly, we just saw 450 prophets of Baal, and all of Israel's like, I wonder which one's going to win. It wasn't like they were on God's side. So Elijah is right about almost everything except one part where he makes up his own reality. And his reality is, I can't tell you how many people have this reality that they've made up in their head. No one likes me. I'm all alone. I don't have any friends. I'm not connected. No one gets me. Have you ever heard this? When we do that, do we live satisfied and at peace? Do we live whole and alive? No, but we do it anyway, just like Elijah did it anyway. It wasn't producing things in his life that we would be like, yay, go Elijah. It's not a model for us to follow. Like, look at Elijah, how well he thought this whole thing through. Because God addresses him. And the thing God addresses him in is, you're not alone. Even with the angel showing up where he asks, take my life, what is God saying to him? You're not alone. I am with you. I will take care of you. I will watch over you. I will protect you. I'm using you. You matter to me. I see you. But Elijah misses it because he has a different narrative in his head. And he thinks that that narrative means certain things in his life, like, my life's not worth living anymore. In verse 18, we find out how unrealistic Elijah's idea of the situation was. God says to him, "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all of whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." Elijah says, "I am the only one." And God says, "I've got 7,000 in Israel." Now, it's not millions. It's not like the whole culture. But Elijah has been convinced that he is way more alone than he actually is. And when his version of what's happening, his fantasy, his imagination of what's happening doesn't get grounded in the reality, he's ready to give up. He's overwhelmed with life. I'm asking you if maybe, just maybe, how you are looking at life, how you are framing it, is more a function of your imagination than reality. And by that, what I mean is, as Elijah looks around him, he had every reason to believe that he was all alone. There was no reason for him to believe he wasn't, except enough humility to know that he didn't know, and that God had him, and that he could walk by faith. It doesn't matter if you're one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, one of the few people who doesn't see death, Elijah. It doesn't matter. When you start to step out of reality and into what you imagine, you can very well stress yourself out. And that's exactly what Elijah did. What God does in his goodness is he reminds us of reality. We can stubbornly refuse to believe it, but God will remind us of reality, whether through situations, through other believers, through his word, through his spirit. Like somehow God is going to tap on your shoulder and say, "Hey, listen, you're not thinking right." And we can be like, "Oh, I don't believe that. I think I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in my life." But if the fruit of how you're thinking is to live worried and stressed and discontent, then you're not looking at reality. If you're a believer, you're not looking at reality. Because reality is that God is with you and God is for you. Look for these kind of words to see this lie doing its work in your soul. It can't get any worse than this. The hits keep on coming. If only this would happen, or I can't wait for that, or when do I get a break? Like those kind of words are words that are hooking us into this idea where I compare fantasy to reality and I think, man, why can't God do what I can imagine? We're actually specifically told in Scripture when we compare our imagination to what God can do, what can God do in comparison to our imagination? So Ephesians 3, he can do far beyond anything we could ask or imagine. So if I'm sitting here imagining that God could do so much more for me and he's not, I'm really having a debate with the Apostle Paul, who said, no, God can do more than I could ask or imagine. Right? So who's right? Well, Paul was speaking under inspiration. I'm probably speaking out of frustration, right? So maybe I need to allow the Spirit of God to turn me around. My advice to you, if this is your battle, is to take Hebrews 13:5, specifically the middle phrase of Hebrews 13:5, and just hold on to it, which is his instruction is this: be content with what you have, which we could paraphrase, be content with what is. Be satisfied with God's grace in your life for this day. Whatever he's put in front of you, be content with what you have. Because the reality is, and we kind of hinted at this when we talked about the Israelites, oh, we don't have any food. Well, now we have food, but we don't like the food. Like, be content with what God has given you, because even if your fantasy came true, you'd still have to learn to be content with that. The change in your circumstance does not change your contentedness. It is a pattern that you decide to live in by faith. All right, so lie number 4, life ought to be as easy and as good as I can imagine. Any questions, thoughts before we get to the next one? Any feedback, thoughts, questions, ideas on that?
I just find it amazing that our faith is so weak.
Mm.
Thousands of years ago, we're no different than Elijah was
Yeah.
with our faith. And what you talked about with all these things here, I was thinking of young people today, not necessarily all young people, but with suicide rates,
Yeah.
just giving up.
Mm-hmm.
It just comes down to faith. They're just not believing in the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so frustrating because we haven't learned anything from history.
Well, I think the reality is this is part of being human. So there's no shame or guilt to this, but it is an invitation to lift up your eyes. If this is your battle, stop trying to imagine something better and start realizing you have something better. In other words, we have hope, so let's live like we do. Right? Elijah had hope, and he did amazing things by it, but in this spot he lost it, and he lost it because he didn't see reality for what it was. So that's our instruction. Let's try to allow God to show us what's real and what's not, instead of us deciding it. Especially that, I'm so alone thing. I'm telling you, talk about a pandemic. That is everywhere. People are more lonely than they've ever been, and a lot of it is what's going on in their own head. The idea that no one likes them and that they don't fit in anywhere, that they can't belong anywhere. It's sometimes is self-fulfilling because you start acting in ways that pull you away from the very provision God has for you instead of stepping into the grace that God has to pour out in your life. Dave.
Just see that the two tools that the enemy loves to use are on full display here, which are lies, and fantasies are a nice way to call lies fantasies.
Yes.
But that's what the Israelites were doing to themselves. It was so nice in Egypt. That's not a fantasy, that's a lie. It wasn't good there. And isolation. And really, lies thrive in isolation.
Yes.
And so when Elijah's all by himself, the further he gets away from his actual home, it's easier to believe I'm all alone.
Yeah.
No one's there. And so to combat the tools of the enemy is reality, truth, and community.
Yep. No, it's a great point, Dave. And the imagery of the enemy as a lion, like that hunting thing, talking about isolating, you can just weave it right into that as a nature illustration of isolation is not a good place to be when you're getting attacked by a lion. So for our enemy to come after us, isolation is not where we want to be. It makes us vulnerable instead of strong. Good stuff. All right, let's get it. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I was just going to say, I think a lot of time the fantasy part is kind of really attractive too because of selfishness
Yeah.
and the easy way out. We know that the Lord can do stuff, but we kind of just want to win the lottery.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
because that is our version of
Yeah.
thinking. We know the Lord doesn't work that way. We have lessons to learn.
Yeah, as Dave talks about lies, which I think is the right label to put on it, but a lot of us wouldn't. It feels a little too hard to digest right away, so that's what it is. But some of the lie that we have is that this should be easy. This should just come to me. If God really cared about me, he would just drop it in my lap. There's no reason for it to be any kind of pain or ache or struggle, or it should just be easy. So we excuse ourselves from the things that God invites us to. But when you excuse yourself from your calling, you also excuse yourself from the harvest. So, yay, you got an excuse. I understand why you didn't do that. Now you don't get any of the stuff God was going to give you as you went on that journey, which stinks. But at least you know why you didn't do it. See, yeah, we excuse ourselves. Good. All right, which leads us right into number 5. One of the reasons we live stressed out, and man, this is so real in our world. We leave things unresolved for the sake of peace, pride, or desires. We leave things unresolved for the sake of peace, pride, or desires. So in my relationship with a person or people, there is some conflict, there is some hurt, and I don't resolve it. I just leave it there. And the reason I leave it there is because I don't want to fight. Fighting is bad. Fighting is unchristian. So therefore, I don't want to fight, so I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to excuse myself from the call to resolve it for the sake of peace. And peace is real Christian, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Or pride. I leave things unresolved because the resolution would be me admitting that I was wrong or out of step or I misunderstood or I didn't see it clearly, whatever. My admission is not something I'm willing to cross, so therefore I will leave it unresolved. I prefer to just leave it out there. I know people who are in such dysfunctional relationships that the expectation is we have a fight, something real comes up, we recognize there's a wrong there, but we won't acknowledge it, we won't make it right, we won't apologize, we won't set anything in motion to resolve it. We just leave it for a while, and we expect that, 3 days go by and everybody's over it, and we just go on. It is so dysfunctional. And what it winds up doing is it winds up making you live in constant tension about what, because it's not resolved, whether it's conscious or subconscious, it's not resolved. So you just leave it there. And then you're waiting for it to volcano up again. And you're walking on eggshells every time you come around a certain topic and whatever. Or desires. I leave things unresolved because of desires. Sometimes there are things that need to get ended, that need to get killed. Paul says in Romans 16, to leave no room for the flesh. In Colossians 3, he says, put to death the works of the flesh. And we're like, well, I'd rather just give it the silent treatment for a little while so that if I want to go back to it. We know that there's this tension because I haven't resolved what God's asking me to do. I've kind of moved on it, but I haven't gone all the way with it. So it's just kind of sitting out there. It's kind of a loaded gun pointed at me all the time. The lie is, it's better for me to leave certain things unresolved and unconfronted because the advantages easily outweigh the costs. We make this evaluation of, but if I say something, but if I try to resolve it, but then the cost is going to be so great and it's just easier. Have you ever said that to yourself? It's just easier to leave it unresolved. Now, can you be honest enough to look back at that and see if it actually got easier? Or if you just lived in tension? If that relationship just got more distant? We tell ourselves we are opting out of conflict. We are opting out of struggle and pain. But we don't. We just shift it to a different thing, this tacit agreement that we're not going to do anything about it. Unresolved conflict brings stress and hurt and pressure into our lives. There's no doubt about it. But we live in it because we think we're supposed to, or because we would rather have short-term good over long-term well-being. Well, I'm supposed to just forget about it. I'm supposed to forgive and forget. I'm supposed to just never mention it. It's supposed to be like it never happened, which is a wrong understanding of what forgiveness actually is. Or, I just don't want to deal with it now, so I'll live with whatever the long-term thing is, but right now I'm just going to take the short-term good. When our children were little, Dustin was a finger sucker. All the other kids use pacifiers, but Dustin was a finger sucker, right? So he's, 18 months old. The difference is with the pacifier, you can take it away. I suppose you could take a finger away too, but that's frowned upon. So we didn't do that. But one night I thought, I'm going to be a good dad, and I'm going to this is the end of you sucking your finger. So I put a sock on his hands, and I kind of taped them on there with whatever good, healthy tape. It wasn't bad tape, whatever. It was good, nice tape of some kind. And he cried for 2 hours in his crib. And I gave in because I couldn't take it anymore. It was too much, right? I couldn't get past feeling like a terrible parent. So I took the socks off, and he sucked his finger until he was 8. And the dentistry orthodontics bill was astronomical, right? That's the exchange we make in our lives over and over and over again. God calls us to courage and healthy interactions, and we go, I can't take that. And we back up from it. And what we say is that we would prefer, in that moment, we subconsciously, we say, I would prefer the short-term relief, and I'll deal with the long-term problems, no problem. I'll kick the can down the road. But then you live with the long-term problems and you can be, why didn't I just deal with the short-term pain? We leave things unresolved because we think we should or because we choose one over the other. This lie is, I should pretend that things are okay instead of confronting them. But the lie is that you're going to confront them one way or the other. You're going to live in the dysfunction, you're going to live in the fallout, or you're going to walk through the journey to resolve it. There's pain any which way. The choice you're having is whether that pain is redemptive or not. Now, this is a confusing area, and I wrote this down because I think it does get confusing. The truth is, we do not control the choices of others. So when I say we leave things unresolved, you're like, well, I've tried to resolve it, but I can't resolve it. Exactly. It is a confusing area. We do not have a say over whether other people do what they're supposed to do to resolve tension or destruction in our lives. But our peace and our relieving of stress, our living without stress, cannot depend on the choices of others. It cannot depend on the choices of others. This is instructive for you to understand that when I'm saying resolving something, I'm not talking about forcing someone else to do what they should or waiting for someone else to do what they should. Your peace cannot depend on someone else doing what they should. So when I'm talking about resolving it, I'm talking about something that you can do, not something that they can do. There are situations where resolution isn't possible until the other party is willing, but you can still resolve it for yourself and have peace. You can't restore with the other person. You can't reconcile with the other person, but you can resolve it in your own soul between you and the Lord, and especially even if you've had the opportunity to invite the other person into that process. So we don't control the choices of others, which leaves us in this tension. The tension is between being peaceable, like never wanting conflict, and I'll just always be nice to everybody, and anybody can do what they want, and kind of I'm a doormat. Or someone who works to establish peace that is reflective of the character of God. Even with people who don't know God, works to establish that kind of peace with other people. We do control our choices. So we are given instructions over and over again. Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So live at peace with everyone. That's like the big headline, right? But the caveat is, as far as it depends on you. The writing of Paul here in this chapter, chapter 12, is a big community chapter. Oh, no one anything but to love them. Let love be sincere. Like this big chapter. Don't penny back evil for evil. Big chapter on community. In the middle of that, he says, live at peace with everyone. But right before that, he says, as much as it depends on you. So our calling is to live at peace with people, pursue peace within the bounds of what we have to choose. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. All right, this is where it gets a little sticky. Love covers a multitude of sins. What does that mean? Love covers a multitude of sins. Is it speaking to resolution for me in that love can resolve wrong done against me without that person trying to make it right? What do you think? Right? Love covers a multitude of sins. It either means that you can overlook minor or small annoyances because love is a bigger thing, whatever, or it can be forgiving a larger wrong by love. When we talk about covering it, we're talking about assessing it. It's not just let it go and whatever. It's understanding what you're covering. You can't cover what you haven't measured, right? Does anybody have a pool you try to cover in the winter? Is it important to know how big that surface area is before you buy a cover and try to put it on there? You're like, I need a pool cover. What size? I don't care. They give you like a, 10 by 10. You're like, well, that doesn't fit. Well, duh. You can't cover what you haven't measured. So love covers a multitude of sin doesn't mean I just go whoosh and let it go and off it goes. Love covers means I've assessed it and I've made a decision that I'm not going to hold that person to account. Sometimes that's the only option you have, and God will give you grace for that. Other times, it's what we try to do, and God won't let us do it. Because on the other side, we are called to confront. Matthew 18, I won't read the whole thing, but the idea is, if just the first part here, if your brother or sister sins, go point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others so that every matter may be established. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. If they refuse to listen even to the church, then treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. The idea of that is resolve. Go confront somebody and resolve it. Make it right. It's in contrast to love covers a multitude of sins. I would say love is still covering the sin here, but it's a different process than we imagine, with the simplicity of like, I don't even have to talk to you and I can let it go. This one is, in order for this to get resolved, I got to go to you, especially as a brother or sister in Christ. I got to go to you. And I'm working to what? What am I working to do here? I'm working to restore. I'm working to get things fixed. That's why I go again and again. I'm not working to gotcha. Like, you did something wrong. And they're like, yeah, I'm sorry, I did. I don't care. I'm bringing 2 or 3 witnesses because that's the next thing. Now I'm going to get my pound of flesh. That's not what it is. The heart is, you go first by yourself because you're like, can we just please take care of this and get this right? And if they're like, there's no problem, you're like, well, there is such a big problem. I have a few people that I'm going to bring so that we can get this right, so that we can see what we're looking at, so we can take care. The passion is to get it right, not to see. So many times it's like, well, does your church believe in church discipline? And what they mean is, do you do like step 1, step 2, step 3, and then out? And we kicked them out. Like it's almost like this badge of honor. We kick people out of our church all the time for everything. The heart of Jesus here is not see how fast you can be like better than and holier than and kick people out. And because what comes off of it is, verse 21, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister? That's like 2-3 verses later in the conversation. How many times do I forgive them? Okay, so you're saying, Peter got the point of go to them and go to them. How many times do I forgive them when they mess up? Like 7? Like the Pharisees said you had to forgive, I think it was 2 or 3 times. Like they had a rule for everything. So they had a rule. Yeah, if a person comes and asks you for forgiveness for an offense, you have to forgive them. And then if they could do it again, the same thing, you have to forgive them again. And then they come a 3rd time and you have to forgive them a 3rd time. But after they've done it 3 times and you've forgiven them the 4th time, you don't have to forgive them anymore. So Peter comes to Jesus and says, how many times do I have to forgive them? 7? Like he's like, look at me, Jesus. I have 7 times. I'm going to forgive him 7 times. And Jesus just annihilates Peter's scarcity in grace, doesn't he? Because he goes, Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. And that you may have heard it 70 times 7. The math is ambiguous. The numbers are ambiguous, but the point is not. The point is, you haven't even started at 7. Resolve. But that resolution, that covering a multitude of sins comes through confrontation. The emphasis to restore through forgiveness, this process. I write down here, spiritual leaders must confront. So in 2 Samuel 12, Nathan goes to David and says, David, you are that man. You did wrong here with David and Bathsheba. You are that man, and you need to make it right. The spiritual leaders need to confront. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, which is over in the side column, Paul says to Timothy, preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, encourage. So the peace and forgiveness are not just all about forget about it, overlook it. Sometimes there is confrontation, and spiritual leaders are called to confront. Parents are called to correct. Proverbs chapter 6, my son, keep your father's command. Do not forsake your mother's teaching, for this command is a lamp. This teaching is a light, and correction and instruction are the way to life. The presumption is that parents are going to give correction to their children, that they are going to confront their children with what is wrong as they're raising them, as they're growing up. That's a holy and divine calling on our lives. All of us in Galatians 6:1 are to reach to those who are straying and struggling. It says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, but watch yourselves, or you may also be tempted. Restoration, to go get someone who's out of line. Not to go pound them, but to go get them and bring them back in. So love covers a multitude of sins, and there's confrontation. So there's tension. Do I just let it go, or do I confront it? It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's almost as though, and for us as believers, that the presumption is that we have a guide within us who will guide us in these areas to show us what we should do in each area. I try to be careful as a pastor not to be so full of myself that I could tell you what you're supposed to do in that area, because I'm not the Spirit of God. You have him inside of you. So you should be learning and training. How do I listen to the Spirit of God to know whether I'm supposed to confront or whether I'm supposed to just let it go? How do I do that? How do we tell the difference between pursuing peace and covering a multitude of sins? We don't want to live in the stress that comes from this unresolved conflict. How do we know which one we should do? I have just a couple of practical things here as we kind of bring this idea to a close tonight. Letter A. If you have tried to overlook the wrong, but it still haunts you, that's probably a sign that you need to go and confront. There's nothing wrong with the fact that you tried to just let it go on your own first. It's not bad. Sometimes it's just a grace-filled heart. But if you've tried to let it go and it still is just in you all the time, and when you see them, it's something you've got to like wrestle over and whatever. If you haven't had a conversation about it, it probably is a sign that you should. Because you tried to just do the love covers a multitude of sins and move on, but it's almost like the Spirit won't let you. When the Spirit wants you to just let it go and move on, there's this miracle of grace that just happens inside of you and it's just gone. It's just, poof, it's gone. And you don't see it anymore. You don't feel it anymore. I'm not saying there's no work to do. There's work to do, but it's different than when it's just always there and you can't seem to get around it. And you just assumed that you were just supposed to not say anything about it and be nice, but now you feel like you have to be mean and go to the person. No, God is prompting you to go in love and confront that person so that you could make it resolved. Small stuff. I'm not talking about you looked sideways at me. You know, there was a time in church where, you sat the row in front of me, you didn't turn around and you didn't say hi to me, and I'm just, 4 months later, I'm carrying that hurt in my, okay, small stuff should just roll off of us, okay? I'm not suggesting we should all be uber sensitive. But if you thought it was small and it doesn't roll off of you, there's probably a deeper problem. There's probably something bigger there. Maybe what was small pointed to something bigger and something deeper, and God was just shining a light on it so you would go take care of it. Peace doesn't require a clean slate where everybody has dealt with everything, but it does require a clear conscience, meaning that if you're supposed to go talk to that person, you have to at least try. You have to go with a forgiving heart, but you have to go. And if they reject you, I have a clear conscience. I may not be able to clean the slate between us, but I have a clear conscience before God. There are some relationships in my life where I would like to see them resolved, but I've put the rug out and offered, and it doesn't happen. And I have to let that go. Because I can't keep living bound to the choices of others. There's a moment there where it's tense, and I'm like struggling to find the right words, and I'm trying to reach out when I'm supposed to reach out, but then it comes to this point where like I believe before the Lord I've done what I'm supposed to do. Now it's between them and the Lord. And now because I have a clear conscience, because I know I've followed God down that path, I can let it go and I can have peace even though it's unresolved between us. It's resolved in me. Does that make sense? Letter B, remember, peace and rest are byproducts. Peace and rests are byproducts. They are things that you get because you have something else. Do you remember what that is from the first lesson? They are byproducts of a relationship we have with Jesus, right? Because we are his, he said, I give you peace. Remember that? Peace I give you, not like they are byproducts of a relationship with Jesus. So, if you find that you cannot escape unresolved tension, particularly when you feel close to the Lord and hear him speaking to you, then God is leading you to go confront so that you can resolve. Confront those who have wronged you with a forgiving heart. Destroy opportunities to go back to what is wrong. Apologize for what you've done wrong. Go and do the work. If you've tried to just forget it and you can't forget it, then that is, especially if you're close to God. If you're far away from God, you need to come back and get into like that relationship with him where you're hearing him and you're following him and you're surrendered to him. And you can't just be like, God, I want to check in. I want advice. I want you to be my consultant. Tell me what I should do here. Like, you've got to be living and walking by the Spirit in order for this to be assured. But really, that's about everything in life, isn't it? You can't be assured about anything in life if you're not walking in step with the Spirit. You're just like guessing and picking and pointing with your own flesh, and your own flesh doesn't see very clearly, so you're going to mess up that way. But if you're walking in step with the Spirit, if you're surrendered to him, I'm not talking about being super spiritual. I'm just saying, God, I want what you want. Show me, lead me. And you can like give that to the Lord. You're doing that on a regular basis. Then if there's something unresolved and you just can't get past it, it's probably God saying, confront. Find the right way. Wait for me to show you the right time, the right words, the right whatever, and then confront that person in humility, like Galatians 6:1 says, in humility, acknowledging my wrongs, but go and set it right. The short-sighted solution of foregoing resolution that seems to bring peace, we didn't have to fight, is also the root of our ongoing stress and the resulting effects like depression, despair, bitterness, anger, compulsion, addiction. It grows out into these other roots, and we're like, I don't know why I'm like this. But we've already decided it's not because I avoid confrontation or I leave things unresolved. What I'm saying to you tonight is maybe God's pointing at you and saying, there are these things in you, there's this pattern in your life, and you may not be able to right now go back and resolve all of that. You may have a long trail of unresolvedness in your past. I guarantee you God is not going to flood you with, you've got to go talk to 45 people tonight. Like, that's not this, okay? But if you recognize that that is my pattern, you can start saying, God, teach me how to confront and resolve in a way that's consistent with who you made me to be, consistent with what it means to be a child of God, and by your grace and in your timing and in your strength, lead me in, teach me how to do that. And I guarantee you what he will do is he will lead you, he will either put it on your heart and kind of drive you into a conversation, or more often, he will bring the conversation to you. Just to kind of get you rolling. Like, God is so good, he knows how to get that going in you. And he will lead you down that path and teach you and train you about how to bring resolution to things that you have not resolved. The last part of it, the desires part of it, like I leave things unresolved because I want to leave the door open, that's kind of a different discussion that we didn't really talk about tonight, but it's a real discussion about I want to kind of keep feet in both worlds. And that's never going to work. That is its own tension. You are creating your own stress by trying to pull together what doesn't go together. What Paul says in 2 Corinthians 6 about what fellowship does light have with darkness, that's the principle he's talking about. You can't live for the Lord and live submitted to the Lord and experience his peace and know his love and have his power in your life and at the same time pursue all this stuff in the world that God's already told you should go. And if you're not actively pursuing it, are you destroying the pathways back there? Because that's what that looks like. For a lot of us, it's not that I'm actively doing it. It's just that I have that door open just in case I ever want, some way back. You don't need a way back. You need a way out. Jesus died for a way out. That's why he came and gave his life for you. All right, any thoughts or questions on that? Reactions, responses? All right. Well, next week we'll dive into yet another 2 lies, trying to make up some time because then some of the big ones towards the end take up more than one lesson. So that'll be fun when we get there. I appreciate you all being with us tonight. I pray that God is at work in your soul. God is pouring out his goodness and his strength in you, giving you insight and directing his work for you uniquely and specifically for the things that he has for you to learn and grow through from this. Let's close tonight in a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the examples and the stories and the teachings that your word gives to us. I pray that your Spirit would open up our eyes so that we could see what you have in this for us. Maybe one of these lies or both of these lies are actively working in us. And right now there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of chaos in our heads or in our souls about what do I do about that? And that's overwhelming and too much. I pray that your Spirit would bring peace as we turn ourselves towards you. Not because we've got it all figured out, but because we know that you are at work and we're going to let you lead us step by step. We're going to learn from you, and maybe we're going to see that you've brought someone into our life or some group of people into our life so that we can hear your voice from your Spirit and from your Spirit in those around us. Pray that you would help us to take the steps you ask us to take when you ask us to take them. I pray that you would stop the enemy from discouraging us, from convincing us that it's pointless or that somehow we're defective or out of touch, that this isn't possible for us. And Father, if these aren't the lies that get us, these lies that we talked about tonight aren't the ones that get us, I'm sure that there's a purpose that we're here tonight. I pray that you would help us to see it, that we would be encouraged by your word, that you would adjust in us where we need to be differently balanced, where we need to hold on to you in a different way, or we need to let you hold on to us in the way that feels unsafe or risky. I pray, Father, that you would do a work in your people, bringing us to a place where we are not just people who talk about peace, but people who live with rest in our souls. So keep doing that work, and we will keep trusting you, looking to you to show us how. We give these things to you in the name of Jesus. Amen.